Pronto. Então, pessoal, vou falar primeiro em português, depois eu faço a apresentação do Alexandre em inglês brevemente, mas primeiro, obrigado, Alexandre, por aceitar prontamente a falar. O Alexandre obteve o título dele de doutor com a tese em Tecnologia dos Estudos, especialmente sobre educação, o papel dessas virtudes como reguladores da educação. A tese dele é um dos trabalhos mais sistemáticos em língua portuguesa sobre o assunto, talvez o trabalho mais sistemático, pelo menos o que eu, em língua portuguesa, é o trabalho mais sistemático que eu conheço. E ele continua pesquisando nas literaturas sobre virtudes, o papel das virtudes na educação, incluindo alguns tópicos relacionados, incluindo o problema colocado pelo ceticismo sobre caráter, que deve ser o tema de sua apresentação hoje, né? Eu agora apresento em inglês brevemente. Alexandre Sven Born obtained his PhD with a thesis on the nature of intellectual virtues and their role as regulators of education. His thesis is one of the most systematic works on the subject in Portuguese language. He continues to do research on virtual education and related topics, including the problem posed by scepticism about character, in particular situationism, and he will be talking about that today with his presentation. Pode começar, Alexandre, a palavra é sua.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So my presentation will be about situationism and the ways it threatens the status of intellectual virtue as an educational ideal. Situationism is a topic that have intrigued me, especially this year. But I need to state that I'm not a situationist. What I will try to do here is to explore different ways situationism threatens the status of intellectual virtue as an educational ideal. So this presentation aims to clarify the major situationist claims in philosophy and to explore both the main situationist argument and in what ways situationist threatens intellectual character education. The first purpose is necessary, given that, as Christian Miller puts it in Character and Moral Psychology, there is no one position or set of clearly articulated claims which goes by the name of situationism. And indeed, the view is very difficult to pin down. Although Miller was apparently referring to situationism in psychology in this context, I think this is somewhat true for situationism in philosophy as well. There are many claims that situationist philosophers do, from negative to positive claims, both descriptive and prescriptive. I will try to clarify this below. The second purpose is what motivated me to engage with this literature in the first place. My interest in situationism is primarily due to my willingness to assess how this challenge threatens the status of intellectual virtue as an educational ideal. Jason Behr anticipates one worry in epistemic situationism, where he states that if intellectual virtue is a rare or non-existent phenomenon, attempts to educate for growth intellectual virtues are likely to seem quixotic at best and a scandalous waste of scarce educational resource at worst. The word noted by Behr derives from the major situationist descriptive claims. Here, I will reveal some cites about intellectual character education that follows from the situationist prescriptive program. So let me begin by a contextualization. The first situationist movement starts in the 60s and was primarily designed to challenge the viability of the entire field of personality psychology. We might call this psychological situationism. And this movement motivated the heated person situation debate in psychology, which, as far as I know, had its peak in the 80s. However, psychological situationism has not triumphed. Nevertheless, from the 90s onwards, philosophers engaged with the psychological literature, such as John Dawes and Gilbert Harman, introduced situationism in the philosophical literature. Situationism was introduced in the philosophical literature primarily as a challenge to virtue ethics, what we might call moral situationism. But almost 2 decades later, when virtue epistemology became to be dominant in the field of epistemology, it was extended as a challenge to virtue epistemology as well, what we might call epistemic situationism. So in philosophy, in my presentation will focus on the philosophical literature here. Situationism might be characterized as a thesis or a set of theses in philosophical psychology. On the one hand, moral situationists believe that the moral psychology which they think virtue ethicists are committed with, particularly in the Aristotelian tradition, is psychologically unrealistic. On the other hand, particularly as a challenge to responsibilist virtue epistemology, epistemic situationists believe that responsibilist virtue epistemologists are committed with similar, if not the same, psychological and realistic assumptions about human psychology. Before proceeding to a more detailed characterization of the major situationist claims, it will be important to present a brief summary of some of the representative studies often presented by situationist philosophers. So here are some representative studies of moral situationism. The first study by Eisen and Levin discovered that subjects who had just found a dime were 22 times more likely to help a woman who had dropped some papers than subjects who did not find a dime. Honey, Banks, and Zimbardo describe how college students role-playing as guards in a simulated prison rapidly descended to pervasive cruelty and abuse. Darlene Batson reported that passers-by not in a hurry were 6 times more likely to help an unfortunate who appeared to be in significant distress than were passers-by in a hurry. Milgram found that subjects who would repeatedly punish a screaming victim with realistic but simulated electroshocks at the polite request of an experimenter. Matthews and Cannon reported that subjects were 5 times more likely to help an apparently injured man who had dropped some books when ambient noise was at normal levels than when a power lawnmower was running nearby. Here we have the 2 most cited representative studies of epistemic situationism. In Ash's famous experiments on social conformity, subjects were asked to judge which lines between A, B, and C was of the same length as the P line. Faced by an animal's descent, the naive subjects, the majority of the naive subjects, show a social conformity. Moreover, Alice Eisen and colleagues discovered that subjects who see few minutes of comedy film or receive a small bag of candy improve their performance on 2 tests generally regarded as requiring creative ingenuity: the Dunker's-Kendall test and the remote associates test. So here I will provide the most precise characterization I could offer. I will try to identify the major situationist claims, at least in the philosophical literature, firstly as a pair of negative descriptive claims, which might be roughly called global character skepticism, and a pair of positive descriptive claims, which can be more properly labeled situationism. These claims, as we will see, raise questions about the viability of intellectual character education. Secondly, however, I will consider a pair of mixed negative positive prescriptive claims, one of which might be roughly called situationist revisionism and the other situationist interventionism, both of which raise questions about the desirability of intellectual character education. So the situationism is a kind of character skepticism, is something suggested both by the titles of their texts advocating for situationism and situationist associated claims. Just like epistemological skepticism challenges epistemologists to vindicate the possession of knowledge among humans, character skepticism challenges virtue theorists to vindicate the widespread possession of virtues and vices among humans. The situationists not only offer a challenge, They also offer positive prescriptive claims. They think situational factors are preponderant in explaining and predicting human behavior, or alternatively, that morally epistemically relevant behavior reliably coverts with morally epistemically irrelevant situational variables. And they accept the widespread possession of character traits that are tied to specific situations. Indeed, the label situationism might be fairly attributed to these positive descriptive claims. So let me try to elucidate these pairs of negative and positive descriptive claims before turning my attention to the situationist prescriptive claims. So let me begin by the pair of negative descriptive claims that situationists make. The first one is that there is a large body of empirical evidence which is incompatible with the widespread possession of global character traits, or alternatively, there is no widespread possession of global character traits. And the second claim is that our folk usage of global personality and character traits in describing and predicting human behavior is empirically unsupported. Note that the first claim is a claim about our characterological psychology, while the second claim is a claim about common linguistic practice among us. Both claims, however, share skepticism about global character traits. Roughly global means not tied to specific situations, synonymous to robust, and in contrast to local, which means tied to specific situations. Therefore, situationists are not necessarily skeptical about every kind of character traits, but about character traits that are not tied to specific situations. Here are the positive descriptive claims. The first one is that a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior is inordinately susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively relevant situational influence, such as ambient sound, smell, lighting. Here I am borrowing from Alfano, the way Mark Alfano articulates the situationist challenge. And the second positive descriptive claim is that the large body of empirical evidence, which is incompatible with the widespread possession of global character traits, is compatible with the possession of local traits. Although this second claim is consensual among situationists, only some of them are willing to endorse local trait theory. Concerning the first claim, it will be illuminating to consider Alfano's classification of situational influence. So Alfano, he classifies three kinds of situational influence in human behavior. The first one is bad reasons, which includes temptation, situational demand, and situational demand characteristics. The second one is what he calls situational non-reasons, which includes ambient sounds, smells, mood elevators, mood depressors. And the third one is what he calls a non-moral individual difference, which includes culture, gender, the big five, and so on. Now, this third group of situational influence will not be relevant here, so I will ignore it, and I will focus on these two kinds of situational influence. So, Funnel claims that temptations are completely familiar to virtue ephesus and slot nicely into their scheme of virtue continence, incontinence, and vice. Situational demand characteristics comprise the subtle features of situations that either give people bad reasons without their realizing it, or induce them to attend too much to bad reasons and too little to good reasons. They tend to influence behavior on the sly, as it were. Two such demand characteristics are the presence of bystanders and social distance cues. So Alfano states that situational demand characteristics may also help to explain the infamous Milgram studies in obedience and the Honeybanks and Zibardo prison simulation. And then he states that because situational no reasons such as sensibility and mood effects are both seemingly trivial and normatively relevant, and because they exert a great deal of influence on people's morally relevant conduct, he considered then to be the heart of the situationist challenge. Bad reasons are bad, but it may be possible to handle them. No reasons are hugely influential, typically unnoticed, and provide no reason for the conduct they induce. So here are the descriptive, what we might call descriptive situationism, which is constituted by two pairs of descriptive claims. One we might classify as global character skepticism, and the other as situationism. Here's a simpler version of the situationist argument. Behavior is typically ordered by robust traits. Systematic observation will reveal pervasive trait-relevant behavioral consistency. Systematic observation does not reveal pervasive trait-relevant behavioral consistency, and therefore behavior is not typically ordered by robust traits. But here is my own reconstruction of the argument by situationists. So the first premise: if sufficient a portion of epistemically and morally significant human behavior is influenced, is inordinately influenced by a normatively relevant situational influence, then people's morally and epistemically significant behavior shows pervasive trait-relevant behavioral inconsistency, which at most is compatible only with a fragmentary account of personality, or compatible only with fragmented personalities. So if a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior shows pervasive trait-relevant behavioral inconsistency, which at most is compatible only with fragmentary account of personality, then global character traits neither explain nor predict a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior. So by hypothetical syllogism, we came with the conclusion that if a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior is inordinately susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively relevant situational influence, then global character traits neither explain nor predict a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior. If the consequence of this conclusion is right, then there is no widespread possession of global character traits, and or folk usage of global character traits in describing and predicting human behavior is empirically inadequate. And then the situationists claim that a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior is inordinately susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively relevant situational influence, and therefore there is no widespread possession of global character traits and or folk usage of global character traits in describing and predicting human behavior is empirically unsupported. Now, in my PhD dissertation, I classified the situationist challenge as a species of viability objection that might be raised against intellectual character education. The argument might be reconstructed such as follows. If there is no widespread possession of global intellectual character traits and a sufficient portion of intellectual conduct is inordinately susceptible to situational known reasons, then intellectual character education is not viable. If it's not viable, then it should be abandoned. And so the situationists claim that there is no widespread possession of global intellectual character traits and a sufficient portion of intellectual conduct is inordinately susceptible to situational known reasons. Therefore, intellectual character education should be abandoned. However, more recently, I came to realize that there is another way to present a situationist argument against intellectual character education, which can be grounded on some of the situationist prescriptive claims, in which case the situationist might threaten not only the viability of the intellectual character education, but also, surprisingly, its desirability. First, there are some prescriptive claims by situationists more closely associated with their claims about our practice of trait description. So either we should stop or try to resist to ascribing global character traits to each other, the point made by Doris, or we should redouble our standards of sufficient evidence for public vice attribution and relax our standards of sufficient evidence for plausible public virtue attribution in order to induce what Marco Fano calls factitious virtues. In this sense, situationists are revisionists about our practice of trait attribution. Particularly, Doris' revisionism about our linguistic practice of trait attribution goes against at least two general strategies in educating for intellectual virtues, namely the direct instruction on the nature and importance of the virtues and the exposure to exemplars of the virtues. Now, maybe the point made by Alfano too goes against some general strategy to educate for intellectual virtues, but I will not explore the Alfano points here. Here the argument can be reconstructed as follows. Intellectual character education requires direct instruction and exposure to exemplars. Direct instruction and exposure to exemplars inevitably involve the description of global character traits. However, for both epistemological and ethical reasons, we should try to resist the use of global character and personality descriptions when explaining and predicting behaviors. This is a point made by Doris. If ethical reasons demand that we should try to resist the use of global character and personality descriptions when explaining and predicting behavior, then the enterprise of intellectual character education is ethically inconvenient. Therefore, the enterprise of intellectual character education is ethically inconvenient, a surprising conclusion. Another kind of descriptive claim that situationists might make is that moral improvement and also epistemic can be brought about most effectively by attending to situational features, as opposed to aiming at the cultivation of character traits. On the other hand, if intellectual virtue is an educational ideal, then it will be educationally appropriate to invite students to intellectually challenging circumstances, and intellectual improvement should aim primarily at the cultivation of good intellectual character traits. Therefore, such prescriptive claims by situationists seem to be patently at odds with intellectual character education. The argument here is that if there is no widespread possession of global intellectual character traits, and epistemic improvement can be brought about most effectively by attending to situational features, as opposed to aiming at the cultivation of good intellectual character traits, then we should not pursue the educational aim of intellectual virtue. The situation is claim 2 and claims 3. Therefore, we should not pursue the educational aim of intellectual virtue. So here is what we might call the prescriptive program of situationists. Now, here is the argument. I will try to assess the argument. I'll try to explore a line of objection to situationists. So I will start from the fourth premise to comment a little. The fourth premise states that a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior is inordinately susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively relevant situational influence. This is an empirical claim. If I want to dispute this claim, I need to address the empirical literature. And this is not my purpose here, so I will suspend my judgment about the fourth premise. The third premise states that if global character traits neither explain nor predict a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior, then there is no widespread possession of global character traits, and our folk usage of global character traits in describing and predicting human behavior is empirically inadequate. I think this premise is true. If the antecedent is the case, then the consequent follows. So I will not dispute this here. The second premise states that if a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior shows pervasive trait-relevant behavioral inconsistence, which at most is compatible only with a fragmentary account of personality, then global character traits neither explain nor predict a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior. Again, I think this premise is true. If the antecedent is the case, then the consequent follows. So I will not dispute this here. I will dispute or try to dispute the first premise. So I will borrow my objection to situationists from Pauline Klingald's egoistic politician case. So she says the following. Suppose a politician endorses helping others in need, but nevertheless reliably acts egoistically. Whether she has a guilty conscience or not, let us suppose she believes that she should be more beneficent. As it is, she sometimes does help others, namely when this is in line with her egoism. For example, in the presence of cameras, she may help a person in need, but from a desire to appear generous or caring. She expects that to have a better chance of winning the next election when the news depicts her acting beneficently. But when there are no cameras, she does not help because she regards doing so not to be in her interest. So Klingel proposed that the situationist analysis of this case is such as follows. She morally endorses helping others in need, but when there are cameras, she helps, and when there are no cameras, she does not help. Therefore, her behavior is inconsistent with her behavior that one would expect on the basis of her moral commitments. And it's not best explained by her conviction that she ought to help or by global, stable, and robust trait of beneficence. Rather, her behavior reliably varies with a beneficence irrelevant feature of the situation, in the case the presence or the absence of cameras. And this situational variable is what best explains her behavior. She is not a beneficent person. At most, she appears to have the local, fragmented, and situation relative trait of beneficence in front of cameras. So Klingel uses this case to motivate alternative explanations based on global and non-malicious vices for some of the empirical results of the situationist literature. This is parallel to what I will do here, but distinct from the lesson I want to draw from this case. As Miller noticed, situations are typically individuated in the situationist literature in terms of their nominal and not their psychologically relevant features. In other words, situationists typically individuate situations by focusing on the nominal features of the situations, the features of the circumstance which is perceivably there, and ignoring the psychologically salient aspects of situations. There is to say the psychological impact of a situation on and its meaning for a person. If we take situations by their psychologically salient aspects, it might be the case that much of the seeming behavioral inconsistency in these studies, contrary to what situationists state, in fact reveals consistent traits. So Dorus recognized this point about the nominal psychological distinction. However, he thinks this point is compatible with his local trait theory. Here I will try to show that if it's required to focus on the psychologically salient aspects of situations in order to assess people's cross-situational consistency, then either his local trait theory seems unreasonable or his local trait theory must be rearticulated in a way that is perfectly familiar, if not to traditional virtue theory, as I believe, at least to folk psychology, namely a way in which traits are individuated as tied to specific psychological states activated by specific circumstances, and in a way which is incompatible with his fragmentary account of personality, namely a way in which people typically have unified selves. To put the dilemma in another way, Doris' local trait theory conceives character traits as situation-indexed stable dispositions. Either Doris' local trait theory specifies nominal features of the situations in order to individuate character traits, or Doris' local trait theory specifies psychologically salient aspects of the situations in order to individuate character traits. If Doris' local trait theory specifies nominal features of the situations in order to individuate character traits, then Doris' local trait theory requires additional reason to reject a more familiar way to understand people's behavior, namely by individuating situations psychologically, as I will show below. If Doris' local trait theory specifies psychologically salient aspects of the situations in order to individuate character traits, then Doris' local trait theory is incompatible with a fragmentary account of personality. And it turns out to be just like folk psychology, maybe with additional jargon, as well as possibly compatible with traditional virtue theory. Suppose a biologist who pursues knowledge enthusiastically while doing field research, but despite exhibiting such intellectual curiosity in a natural environment, do not pursue knowledge enthusiastically in the lab. Doris' local trait theory proposes that we need to individuate such biologist's personality such as follows. He is curious while in the field, but uncurious while in the lab. The lab and the natural environment as such are situations nominally individuated. But what happens if we individuate situations by their psychologically salient aspects? In this case, we identify what in the psychology of our biologist gives sense to this apparently inconsistency in his behavior. For instance, it might be the case that natural environments evoke positive emotions or episodic memories. It might also be the case that he might hold methodological beliefs which motivate him to do more field research than lab research. And a final suggestion, it might be the case that he holds ethical beliefs about doing field research and doing lab experiments in animals. Now, note that these are folk psychological explanations. And if these folk psychological explanations are correct, then we have reasons to suppose our biologists have a coherent, unified self instead of fragmented personality, right? So the premise I'm suspicious about states that if sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior is inordinately susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively relevant situational influence, then a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior shows pervasive trait-relevant behavioral inconsistency, which at most is compatible only with a fragmentary account of personality. The point I want to motivate here is that if we take situations by their psychologically salient aspects, the consequence does not follow necessarily from the antecedent. It's possible that a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior shows pervasive trait-relevant behavioral consistency if the situations are individuated psychologically, in which case, contrary to a fragmentary account of personality, we can make sense of a unified self, even if a sufficient portion of morally and epistemically significant human behavior is inordinately susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively relevant situational influences. So this presentation engaged with the philosophical literature about situationism and tried to clarify what are the major claims by situationist philosophers. I proposed that situationist philosophers are fundamentally committed with two pairs of descriptive claims, but also that they make some prescriptive claims. Given their major descriptive claims, I tried to reconstruct the situationist fundamental argument against virtue theory And given their major descriptive and prescriptive claims, I try to explore in what ways it threatens the status of intellectual virtue as an educational ideal. Basically, the situation as major descriptive claims raise questions about the viability of intellectual character education, whereas situation as major prescriptive claims raise two objections about the desirability of intellectual character education. I did not have time enough to give a full assessment of the situation as main argument and objections against intellectual character education, but I tried to motivate some suspicion about the first premise of the main situation as argument, which might point to some plausible direction. The next steps should be to see how my assessment of this first premise can be applied to the empirical studies and to assess each situation as objection against intellectual character education. Thank you.
Obrigado, Alexandre. Agora a gente começa a sessão de perguntas. Mas acabou... a gente ainda está defasado no tempo. Talvez a gente consiga recompor agora. So thank you, Alexandre, so much for your presentation. The question section is open, and we have a question from Christian Miller. You can talk, Miller.
Great, thank you so much. So that was a really thorough and very, I think, accurate engagement with the literature. Literature I've spent a lot of time with engaging myself. So thank you for that great presentation. So I think I agree with it, with just about everything you said. And I just want to push you right into my own view, because everything you said leads precisely to my own view, which I like. So you're pointing out the difference between nominal and psychologically salient situations. Others have done that. Nancy Snow's done that. Dan Russell's done that. I've done that. You're noting that if you pay attention to the psychologically salient features of situations, then there's going to be actual remarkable behavioral consistency rather than fragmentation, which is, I think, absolutely the right thing to say. So in studies like the bystander studies, the lesson is not inconsistency, it's consistency with respect to things like fear of embarrassment. So when we are afraid of embarrassing ourselves in front of others, we're likely not to help. When that fear of embarrassment is not at work, we are likely to help in these kind of situations. You can do this run this kind of story over and over again for lots of the other studies like Milgram, for the smell studies, for the DIME study, and so forth. I also entirely agree with you about the local trait model is not empirically supported. But why not at this point just conclude that there's good reason for thinking that there are character traits, global character traits, that are made up of these psychological tendencies that are revealed in the studies. So that's what I do. I say that there's still good reason for thinking that there are global traits, as you know, if you read, you read the book. But there's still a challenge that remains, though. So the challenge that remains is the character that emerges from this literature is not a virtuous character. So there's still a significant character gap between how we should be and how we actually are, for the most part. These character traits are mixed character traits, as I described them. And so there's a lot of work still to be done in outlining strategies for improving character so that our mixed character traits become more virtuous. So the question is, are you willing to go that far? Go as far as my view.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic with your mixed trait theory that I think goes in this way. I agree with you. I don't disagree.
Hey, okay, I'm done. My job is done today.
Uh,
I'll let others jump in. I can come back later.
So, Professor Beer, you have something to say?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the paper. A very clear, very good job of laying out the reasoning and the logic of the situationist arguments. And I'm sympathetic to your rebuttal. I think that there are other good rebuttals that would still preserve the idea of intellectual character education understood in the right way. I do have a question about one specific claim that you sort of attributed to situationists. But before getting to that, I guess I just want to sort of step back and call attention to a couple of things, and that I'd love to hear your response to if you have one. So I am always struck by the argument that goes something like this. People don't have these traits, therefore educating for the sake of these traits is a bad idea. Why not think it goes the other way around? I'm not going to actually defend this, but you might think the absence of those traits is precisely why we need to start educating for these traits. Now, I don't think it's that simple, because I don't think it's that easy to change people's character, but the mere absence of them, to my mind, doesn't by itself say anything about whether we should try to educate for them. In fact, if it says anything, I think it says that we should try to educate for them because people don't have them. And it's funny to me that in a way, Doris himself can't help from suggesting something similar. I don't know if this is something that other people have picked up on in the literature, but you mentioned his comment that sort of in light of, you know, our lack of virtues, we ought to pay closer attention to, we ought to learn to attend to situational factors, right? And I'm going to quickly zip over to a different document of mine where I have some other quotes from him. He actually goes so far as to say that that we should try to develop habits of judgment that are fair-minded and sensitive. That we ought to focus on attending to the determinative features of situations. That we should avoid culpable naivete or insufficiently careful attention to situations. And then he says that we might have duties, we might have cognitive duties to attend in our deliberations to determinative features of situations. So presumably he thinks we can develop those sort of attentional habits. And to my mind, those attentional habits, understood in the right way, start to look like intellectual virtues, like attentiveness or intellectual carefulness, or a kind of intellectual humility or honesty. Anyway, that's my sort of soapbox remark. I'd love to, you know, why don't I, instead of now going to a different question, why don't I just see if you have any thoughts about that, and then I'll get back in line and can get to the other question I was gonna ask later on, time permitting.
Okay, your point is very is the same point that Rodgers and Warnke states in their article. And situationism, the prescriptive program of situationism is conflated with their aims. And but also I think what they are stating is that granted that global character traits, there is no widespread possession of global character traits, then the purpose of educating for global character traits, good character traits, such as intellectual virtues and moral virtues, is not possible. And I think their argument that must be that might be reconstructed to raise a question about the viability of intellectual character education is this. But they also have in their prescriptive claims some reasons to regard intellectual character education as something desirable, such as Doris talks about the abnormality of global character traits. He thinks that it's that the fact that we don't there is no widespread possession of global character traits is something that indicates mental health. And he also he thinks that the moral discourse of virtue ethics it goes to something elitist discourse. So we need to engage with these reasons to give an objection to their way they reason. I don't know if I
agree with what you said. I agree that look, I think those of us interested in intellectual character education need to take the situationist literature and what it reveals about the limitations of our character very seriously. And I think what we know empirically about character needs to shape how we understand what intellectual character education might look like. So I don't want to, I'm not being dismissive toward the literature at all. Really, the first point is just, it's just, I'm not sure that it actually shows that there should be no such educational efforts, rather than what efforts exist ought to be mindful of what we know empirically about the limitations and fragility of character. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you.
So we have a question from Celso Oliveira. I will read it if you don't mind, Celso. Celso asks, the situationist empirical data is based on effects on probabilistic every human have, right? So in your refutation, you use individual cases, like a particular biologist. Is this a problem?
Posso responder em português?
Acho que sim, então, acho sem problema. Deixa eu traduzir então a pergunta primeiro, se você nos importar. O Celso pergunta se é um problema aqui para a evolução do Alexandre o fato de que os dados empíricos que os situacionistas usam são, para levantar o argumento deles, são dados sobre coisas como vieses que todas as pessoas, a princípio, teriam, né? E quanto à refutação do Alexandre, parece se basear mais em casos individuais. E se isso não é um problema, isso não enfraquece a posição dele.
Eu acho que não, porque eu tô me baseando num experimento mental, né? Claro, e essa experiência de pensamento, o que ela está querendo mostrar é que talvez a gente tenha que reolhar para os estudos, para os resultados dos estudos, e ver se as conclusões que os situacionistas tiram dos estudos, que não são exatamente, nem sempre são estudos que defendem o situacionismo, que tem como conclusão a tese situacionista, rever esses estudos e ver se os resultados realmente indicam aquilo ou se podem ser vistos de uma outra maneira. Se o que eles estão indicando é alguma outra tese. Eu acho que o problema aqui é da interpretação dos resultados dos estudos. Como que a gente interpreta?
So, Professor Brio, do you have a follow-up question? If you have a follow-up question, you
Yes, I do. I do. If we have time, are you sure we have time?
We have 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll try to be quick. So I'm interested in the application of one of the situationist prescriptions to the specific practices of direct instruction and exposure to exemplars. And as I understood it, the claim was that those practices inherently contradict the idea or the prescription that we shouldn't appeal to virtue concepts to explain and predict ordinary behavior, right? That the idea is, look, we have good reasons to think that we shouldn't appeal to virtue concepts to explain or predict human behavior, but when we engage in direct instruction and exposure to exemplars, we do that. And I guess I don't see why there aren't ways of engaging in direct instruction about the virtues, and also ways of upholding certain relevant exemplars of virtue that don't seek to either, in the case of exemplars, the idea wouldn't be to say, this is why, most people are motivated like this person, right? You wouldn't say that. That would be trying to use the exemplar to explain behavior, which you wouldn't want to do. Similarly, I would think that we could engage in direct instruction in intellectual virtues or moral virtues in ways that are sensitive to and incorporate some of the empirical literature about the nature and fragility of character. So I just don't see why that prescription categorically rules out direct instruction or exposure to exemplars, rather than ruling out certain misuses of those practices.
So maybe I'm conceiving direct instruction and exposure to exemplars in a way that might be ruled out. So as I think about direct instruction, is about talking about intellectual virtues, and here I'm thinking about global character traits, right? And exposure to exemplars, as I conceive it, we are ascribing global character traits such as intellectual honesty, intellectual humility to exemplars who we think to people who we think are exemplars. So I think this goes against the prescription of trying to resist the use of global character traits, the use of global character traits ascription to each other.
Right. I guess I'd just say, I think we can engage in direct instruction about character in ways that don't involve teaching that global traits are widespread, one. And then when it comes, but no one would deny that there are rare occasional exemplars of global traits, say. And there, I think the idea would be to be very clear that we're upholding these exemplars as ideals, very different from us. And we have to be careful about how we use those ideals, because if we set ideals before our children or our students that they can't ever realistically hope to approximate or make progress toward, well, then we're just setting them up for failure. But again, that's a kind of ham-fisted use of exemplars, and I think we needn't use them in that way.
Okay, so do you have an example of using direct instruction or exposure that not commit us with the use of global trait description?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about what open-mindedness or fair-mindedness is to our students, say, we can be explicit about the fact that maybe one, these are kind of ideals, and the idea is to try to make meaningful progress towards them, and to be very upfront about the fact that these are not qualities that most people possess to a high degree, and that explain most of our behaviors. And in fact, we could even explore with them some of the ways in which our tendencies to act in ways that approximate these ideals are situation relative or specific. So underscoring the fragility of the way that these qualities are actually instantiated by most people.
I'm happy to accept this. So you reject the second premise of that argument. I think that direct instruction and exposure to exemplars entails
Yes.
global. Okay.
Não, terminou, né, Alexandre? Sua fala?
Sim.
A impressão que você está falando. Então, muito obrigado, Alexandre, pela apresentação, pela discussão. Eu sei que você aceitou em participar no meio de um processo, né, de um concurso, o que é extremamente difícil fazer, se concentrar em dois tipos de atividades assim, tão demandantes ao mesmo tempo. Provavelmente você não é o único caso aqui, talvez, mas eu sei o quanto isso é difícil. E agradeço a presença. E deixa eu encerrar a apresentação, a gravação e começar mais uma vez.